What's going on YouTube? It's Sabby Sabs, and today I'm going to talk to you about what it's like to work in higher education, meaning university or college. Are you interested in working in higher ed? Have you always wanted to work at a university? Well, today I'm here to give you a couple of tips and some suggestions on what you may need to do to get your foot in the door and how to advance your career in higher ed. Before we get started, don't forget to hit like and subscribe below. Alright, so you want to work at a college or a university. You want a career in higher education. Well, I happen to work in higher ed, and I can give you a couple of tips here to help get your career moving. Rule number one, or tip number one, before you start working in higher ed, you need to ask yourself, what area in higher ed do you want to work in? This is the most important question you need to ask yourself. The reason being is sometimes people want to work at a university or a college because they like the perks or they like the idea of working at a school, but they may not have an area chosen that they want to work in. So they end up taking a job at a university or a college and then realizing they don't even like that field. You may end up working in financial services and realize you don't like working with numbers, things like that. So figure out the area of higher ed that you want to work in. What does that mean? There are different fields in higher education that you can work in. Student services, financial services, grants and administration, housing, res life, dining services, counseling, student affairs. So many different options, and those are just a few that I've listed. So I'll use myself as an example. So for me, I always wanted to work with students. And once I started working with students, I wanted to move up in that field, which usually will mean taking on some form of program management and increased academic advising. So that's just something to think about if you want to go into student services. Now, what I commonly see, and this is a common mistake, is that someone may take a job at a university just because they want to work at a university. And let's say they take a job in financial aid. Financial aid is a field of its own, okay? If you don't like dealing with forms, applications, dealing with parents, dealing with students' concerns about aid, federal regulations, and all that kind of stuff, financial aid services is not going to be the best field for you to work in. But back to my example. So let's say that you're working in financial aid and you realize, I want to be an academic advisor. Here is where the problem comes in for some people. A lot of people don't realize that in higher ed, the field that you start out in sometimes can be the field that you are stuck in. Let me go back to the financial aid example. So for example, you're working in financial aid as an office assistant. Not uncommon when you're first starting in higher ed to start as like an office assistant or an administrative assistant, just to be clear. And you're doing that job and you know that your end game is to become a academic advisor / program manager. Where you may have difficulty is that when those positions open up at the school that you work at and you apply for them, you may find that you're not qualified for those positions. Even though you are already an internal employee and you've already had higher ed experience, you won't be qualified for those positions because those positions usually want someone who already has experience advising students, experience working with academic programs, and sometimes those positions may require that you have a master's degree. So in that example, you would have been better off starting out in an academic office or a department and working as an office assistant in that field and then working your way up. But colleges in general, especially when it comes to the hiring process, your application may not even get picked up for that job of program manager because it won't match the application tracking system. This is the system that picks up certain words from your resume and your cover letter that match the job description. So that is where you may have difficulty. So rule number one, figure out which area that you want to work in and try to get an entry level position in that area. That is going to be the best thing and the number one thing that you should do first when going into higher ed. Number two, another mistake that I've seen people make in higher education is that they are unwilling to move. So sometimes, depending on the size of the school you're at and depending on the funding and all of that stuff, there may not be positions available in your department or at your school that will help you advance your career. This means that sometimes you may have to be willing to go to another school. This is where a lot of people have difficulty. Some people, they like the school that they work at. They like the people, they like the community. They don't want to go work at a different university. They don't want to start over at a different space. So they feel like they'll stay in the position that they're in and just hoping that something comes up. That is one of the worst things that you can do if you are trying to advance your career in higher ed. You have to be willing to change schools. If you live in an area like I do in the Boston area, we have that opportunity. There are a lot of colleges here. But if you live in an area or a town where like there's maybe only one school and that's the one that you work at, this may mean you may have to move yourself a little bit further, like to another city or to another state. This is not uncommon. In higher ed, people change schools, people change departments, people change programs. That is really how most of us move up in our careers. So you have to be willing to the possibility of maybe going to another university. Now, number three, what does that entail? So that means that you may have to learn new programs, new systems, and just overall new method of doing things and that kind of stuff, because believe it or not all universities use the same software systems. We don't have the same processes. We don't have the same procedures. So that being said, you may work at one school that may still do paper applications, but the school down the street from you may have everything electronic, which means you may have to learn their software systems or just different software systems in general. These are things you want to prepare yourself from when you're working in higher ed and you want to move up in your career. But let's keep it real. How do you even get into higher ed to begin with? How do you get your foot in the door? The number one way of getting a job in higher ed is going to be pretty much the same for other industries in a sense. Networking. Meet people. Find people who work in higher ed. 99% of the time, if you have an employee reference at the university you are applying to, you are more likely to get your application picked up and to be considered for an interview. Networking is very important. Even in higher education, sometimes it's all about who you know. What you need to understand is that hundreds of people apply for positions at universities every year. You may have one position for an assistant dean, for example. Depending on the school, you could get 100, 200 applications for that one position. You need to have something that sets you apart from everybody else that's applying. And this is why I'm telling you how important networking can be. Another thing that you can do, if you don't happen to meet anybody that works at a university that you're applying to, try temp agencies. Some people actually get into universities or get their foot in the door at universities by going through a temp agency. and that temp agency may specialize in higher education job placement. Now, in the Boston area, certain schools here work with temp agencies. So for example, one of the temp agencies that Harvard works with is Randstad. So you may want to start with Randstad. And this may mean, again, you still may have to start off at an entry-level position, and you may be temp for 2 months, 3 months. You may be temp for 6 months. But the point is to do your job and do it well while you're temp, and then hopefully that can turn into full-time employment for you or gainable employment for you. So you really want to try to use different avenues, because higher ed, from my experience, is not an easy industry to get into. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience. So I actually started off in healthcare. I started off at a company called National Healthcare Corporation. I did not have any experience in higher education other than being a student. And so when I decided to change my career, I was a career changer, and go into higher ed, even though I already had work experience and I had a college degree, I still had to start entry level in higher ed. I was an administrative assistant. I got that position by going through a temp agency. I was temp for like 3 months, and then my position turned into a permanent full-time position. I went from that position to becoming a graduate coordinator, working with grad students and grad program, to becoming a program manager. But I didn't get those positions by staying in the same department. I didn't get those positions by staying in the same school. I switched departments to do the grad coordinator position, and then I switched schools to get program management experience. So each time I did move up and I was advancing in my career, which is what my goal was, which is what I was out, to do. But I was flexible. I was willing to move. I was willing to relocate. I was willing to go to different departments, different schools, all those types of things. But more importantly, I never stopped learning. I wanted to learn more and more about higher ed as I went along. I had a master's degree in higher education administration from Northeastern University. But I want to tell you something about that. You are not the only person with a master's degree that is applying for positions in higher ed that require a master's degree. So again, the networking is important. I knew people at different schools. I got out there and I socialized and I navigated. I went through a temp agency. All the things that I'm telling you to do, I did those things. And so what I see sometimes is that students will graduate and they'll get their master's in higher ed administration, and they think that because they have the master's that all of a sudden they're going to get like a director position or they're going to get an assistant dean position. That's not how it works. Those positions, they still want you to already have some type of experience managing programs, managing students, managing people, supervising, all kinds of things. So the degree itself isn't enough. Even after I got my master's, I still was not in a manager capacity role. I still wasn't able to get a program management position because they still wanted me to have more experience advising students, working with graduate programs, event planning. I still had to wait to get that experience, and then I got the program manager roles. So I think a lot of times people say, oh, I want to work at a university. It'll be great. I get all these holidays off. I get excellent vacation time. I get all these perks. And it is fun. Don't get me wrong. It is great working at a university. I enjoy it. And I love working with students. So this is great for me. But what I want to encourage everyone else to do who's interested in this path is to just be patient. Not everything's going to happen for you very quickly. And to be willing to use those other tools that I recommended, the networking, the temp agencies, relocating, going to different schools. In the Boston area, it is not uncommon for people to hop to different schools. I hate to say it like that, but it's true. Like hop to different schools. They may be at Boston University and then they'll go to Harvard and then they may go to MIT and then they may go to back to Boston University. That's how a lot of people here move up within higher ed. So you have to be flexible and you have to be willing to go that extra mile, but you can do it. Make sure that you assess yourself and your personality as well. This is one thing that I didn't mention earlier that I should have mentioned. If you know that you are introverted and you know you don't like working on teams, then maybe an office that relies heavily on teams and is student-facing positions, maybe that's not the best position for you. Maybe you might be better off doing something like grant management, where you manage the grants and the funding and things like that. Those positions are usually siloed or secluded, and it doesn't require you to be very social. But if you're like me and you like working with students and you consider yourself to be an extrovert and you like to get out there and just do your thing, and that's what I like to do, I encourage you to go into student fields, go into academic advising, go into student affairs, but also you have to have a little bit of humbleness and you have to be a little bit more patient. And I would also say that you need to be able to deal with conflict. If you know that you don't like dealing with conflict, then maybe working in student affairs is not good for you, because you will have different situations that come up from anything from Title IX to mental health issues and things like that. If you don't want to deal with those things, then working in student affairs or even working with students may not be the best area for you in higher education. So I encourage you to research the different fields, and that's one of the good things about the Higher Education Administration program that I did at Northeastern, which I think is a top-notch program, by the way. I got the opportunity to do that. Different classes that I took focused on different fields and leadership and teaming. And so I was able to figure out pretty early on what I wanted to do in higher ed and what I didn't want to do in higher ed. So just take those tips. If you have any other questions about working in higher ed, getting jobs at colleges and universities, anything else that you want to ask me about what it's like to work in this field, send me a little comment below. You can send me a little chat message or whatever. I'm here to answer your questions. And as usual, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe below. And I'll be back later on with more videos.